Well, I had hoped to have a presentation to go along with our lesson tonight, but I'm not the most tech-savvy person on some of this stuff, so hopefully by next week I can get all the kinks worked out and we'll have PowerPoint to go with our lesson. Now, it's been years and years, probably 15 years since I've done anything with PowerPoint, so it's going to be a relearning curve. But I think it's going to be a good tool to help us in understanding this subject of Christian evidences. I have a lot of things on the PowerPoint that are not in the book, and so we may get to some of those things tonight. We may not. If we do, I'll be sure and go slow through those things so that you can write those down if you want to. It seems like anymore, at least in this class, all we do is have technical difficulties. You know, last Wednesday night, we had issues with the microphone not wanting to work, and then I found out that what had happened, apparently I need to keep my big feet out from under the pulpit. I had apparently kicked power cord sometime on Sunday and unplugged the wireless, and so that's why the wireless wasn't working last Wednesday night. But it sounds like it's working fine tonight. But it is good to see everybody. Before we get started with our class this evening, Carrie, would you lead us in a word of prayer?
Pray, Father, that we can not be deceived by Satan, but understand that your word is true. Pray that you be with Josh as he directs our class. In Jesus' name.
Last week, in our introduction to this subject of Christian evidences, we began by looking at just a general introduction about what Christian evidences are. We talked about how this is a subset of a larger study that's known as Christian apologetics, or the ability and the knowledge to defend our beliefs, the things that we understand about the existence of God, about the Bible being God's Word. And then we started looking at some of the, as our book refers to it, the faces of, or the different types of non-believers. But we talked a little bit as well about another subject that I mentioned that I felt was crucial for our study, that being the different types of believers that there are. And so we talked about the concept of monotheism, being those who believe in just one God. We talked about polytheism, those that believe in many different gods, as well as several of the subset groups that fall under those categories. And then we spent some time talking about atheism. And atheism, you may remember, I gave the definition that's found in the book, and that is simply without God. An atheist is one who believes without a shadow of a doubt that God does not exist. They will many times seek to defend such a position. But we left off last week with a quote, and this quote I believe is also found in your study manual. It's from the science fiction writer Isaac Asimov, and what this sets forth is the mentality that many proclaimed atheists have toward this view. He says, emotionally, I am an atheist. I don't have the evidence to prove that God doesn't exist, but I so strongly suspect that He doesn't, that I don't want to waste my time. Now, atheism, as we acknowledged last week, atheism is not able to defend the proposition that God does not exist. Neither can it offer a suitable alternative for believing in God. But then, tonight, we're going to pick up our study with the subject of agnosticism. Now, we're going to be seeing some big terms that maybe you've not heard before, but certainly these are concepts that I'm sure that you have encountered from time to time. And so as we go through, we talked about the theist, the atheist. Now, an agnostic is one who neither believes nor disbelieves in deity. And what they claim is that they do not have enough evidence to prove one way or the other. They claim that certainly God could exist, but we've not ever received sufficient proof, sufficient evidence to support the belief that God exists. Now, most agnostics will not go so far as to claim an atheistic view. Most of them will not come out and say, I do not believe in God. Most of them will take the stance, I doubt the existence of God. They'll say, I've never been presented with sufficient evidence to prove that there is a God. But one way that we might put that is that in a sense, they are still holding out a degree of hope. There's still a degree of receptibility there, indicating that they believe that there is the possibility that God exists. But they've not ever received sufficient evidence. Now, your book says that a good definition of an agnostic is without knowledge. And I think that fits well with what we've been discussing thus far from the standpoint that they claim that they've never been presented with the evidence. They've never been presented with the knowledge that was necessary for them to establish that kind of faith. And so when we look at this concept of being without knowledge, they take this mentality so often, and this is in your book. They say, I don't know, you don't know, nobody knows, and nobody can know if there is a God. They say that the evidence is just not there. There's not enough evidence in the world to prove whether God exists or not. Therefore, they say, I don't know, you don't know, no one can know, therefore, we don't know. And so they live in this constant state of doubt, constant state of wonder. Well, is this really the case or not? But one thing that I really liked about a statement from your book is that very last sentence that we see in this paragraph dealing with agnostics. Notice it says that perhaps the agnostic cannot find God for the same reason a thief cannot find a policeman. What would that answer be? They don't want to. They don't want to. A thief can't find a policeman because he don't want to find a policeman. An agnostic, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more when we get into some of the causes of disbelief later in this chapter, many of them have a bias against God. And so they don't want that to change. They like the way they're living their life. They like the worldly pleasures that they're involved in. And they really don't want to believe in God, because if they did place their faith in God, then they would have to change many of those things they enjoy. And so they have a bias against God. But then we have the skeptic. A skeptic is one who doubts the existence of God based upon personal knowledge. A skeptic is a person who doubts that there is a God, but one thing that is unique, that sets a skeptic apart from an agnostic, is the fact that a skeptic believes that the knowledge of God is out there. That it is attainable if you know where to look. But they're skeptical because they've never been presented with that knowledge. They doubt it. They don't doubt that the knowledge of whether God exists or not is out there. They say, yes, that knowledge is out there if you know where to look. But they doubt it because they've never been presented with that knowledge. Now, a skeptic, the thing to keep in mind with them is whenever we look at that, they say that there could be a God. But as we talked about in our introductory lesson last week, since God cannot be proven in a sensory way, meaning by using the 5 senses. We can't touch, taste, smell. We cannot prove the existence of God in that tangible fashion in that way. Therefore, many skeptics look at this and they say, well, since we can't prove it this way, and this is what the scientific method tells us we have to do in order to establish truth, then we've still not been presented with the evidence. It doesn't matter how much you try to reason with them, how much you try to speak with them. They've been led to believe that if you cannot prove this based upon a physical, sensory, scientific way, then they're going to remain skeptical. That knowledge may be out there, but they just have not found it yet. Then we come into a category that I want to spend some time talking about, and this is really going to carry us into this next section. We have a section on infidels. Now, an infidel, I would refer to them as a radical atheist. You know, there are many people in the world around us today who do not believe in God, but they do not try to force that belief on others. They are not outspoken in that. And you know, sadly, we can even say that there are many people in the world around us today who claim to be Christians, but they're not outspoken about their faith. But in this, when we look at this concept of an infidel, a radical atheist who wants to force their views on everyone else. They're not satisfied in the fact that they don't believe in God. They don't want anyone to believe in God. To me, and you may disagree, but to me, folks, this is the most dangerous form of unbelief. Because this is a person who is willing to do whatever it takes to kill your faith. And we're going to look at some examples later on of those who were even willing to resort to physical violence in order to kill a person's faith. So in my opinion, an infidel is the most dangerous type of unbeliever that there is. An infidel will do all that they can to destroy faith, to speak out against God and condemn religion. But with that, and I wish this was working so that you could see all of this, oftentimes their hatred and their disagreement is not just directed toward God. You know, so many times we see those who are atheistic who say, well, I don't believe in God because I've been hurt, or I don't believe in God because this has happened in my life. Their hatred is directed toward God. Well, an infidel is one who not only is directing his hatred toward God, but he's directing his hatred toward anyone who believes in God. And so they are going to do everything in their power to try to kill that person's faith. Everything they can to turn that believer into a non-believer. Now, this could be that this person is opposed to religion in all of its forms. They are opposed to any type of religious belief that's out there. But also one that's more prominent in the world around us today is this. It's those that are opposed to other religious beliefs. Meaning those who are opposed to beliefs that are different from the beliefs that you espouse. Well, what are some examples that we see of that? Well, let's go back into the Old Testament for just a moment. When the children of Israel were carried off into Babylonian captivity, what did Nebuchadnezzar do whenever he rose to power? Y'all speak up. What did Nebuchadnezzar do? What did he expect of the people? He expected them to bow down before him. To view him as a god. Well, what happened to those who would not do that? You remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? They were cast into a fiery furnace. Now, Nebuchadnezzar's intention was to kill these men. Why? Because to him they were an infidel. They were not going along with what he wanted them to do religiously. And so we see this is an old practice. This is an old ideology. It's not something that has come about in just the last few centuries. You know, we can move even further into the Bible. What about the Jews in the first century? Why was Jesus put to death? Because he did not go along with the religion of the Jews of the day. Now, was he living faithful to the law of Moses? Yes. But he was not going to pattern his life after the perverted form of Judaism that the scribes, the Pharisees, and the religious leaders of the day were promoting. And so what happened? They saw him as a blasphemer. This man is an infidel. But really, who is the infidel? It was the Jews. They were opposed to anyone that did not ascribe to their belief system. Well, let's take it a step further. What about the Romans? The Romans, they expected everyone other than those who had a political agreement with Rome, such as the Jews. They expected every person to bow down to their false gods and to bow down to who else? To Caesar. Well, what happened if you refused to do that? Well, at the very least, you lost all of your Roman rights. At the most, you were taken into the Colosseum and you were fed to hungry animals. Why? Because they would not go along with their religious beliefs. The Romans were infidels. We move on a little bit further. What about the Catholic Church during the days of the Inquisition? Anyone that was not willing to give their allegiance to the Pope. They suffered tremendous persecution. Many of them lost their lives. Again, we ask the question, who was the infidel? Well, we come on down. What about Nazi Germany? They were an atheistic form of government. And who was their enemy? Jews? Catholics? Anyone that stood opposed to their atheistic beliefs? Infidels. What about radical Islam? How many places in the world today do we see people that are being forced into a religious belief at the end of a sword? And those who will not accept that belief system are put to death, oftentimes in terrible ways. Yes, ma'am?
North Korea does not have any religion. They won't allow religion there. Would that fall?
They would fall under the category of an infidel, yes.
Okay.
An infidel is someone who is radically anti-religion.
That's kind of what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Would fall under that.
And then I put one more in here. Some may not like this one. But how about many of our American politicians today? We won't spend much time on that because I know it's a very hot topic. But how many of our American politicians today are trying to kill every semblance of religion? These would all fall under the category of an infidel. Now, for the purpose of our study on Christian evidences, the key word there is Christian. So whenever you hear me use the term infidel in our study, what I'm going to be talking about are those who are opposed to Christianity. and those who are radical in their opposition to Christianity. But here's something else that I want you to keep in mind, and I mentioned something similar to this just a moment ago. All infidels are atheists, but not all atheists are infidels. Keep that in mind. All infidels are atheists because they are anti-religion, anti-God. Now remember, I'm talking about this from the standpoint of our study. I'm not talking about those that say the Muslims who believe in God, believe in Allah, believe that He is deity. I'm not talking about atheism from that point of view. I'm talking about it from the standpoint of those who are opposed to the God of the Bible. Those who are opposed to Christianity. From that standpoint, all infidels are atheists. But not all atheists are infidels. I mentioned a few minutes ago about the fact that there are many people in the world around us today who claim to not believe in God. But they are not radical in those beliefs. They're not trying to force those beliefs on anyone else. That person would be considered an atheist, but they would not be considered an infidel in the sense that we are using this term. Now let's talk about some of the reasons for unbelief. I mentioned just a few minutes ago about this first one that's mentioned in your book, bias against God. Whenever we think about bias against God, I found a quote, and part of this is mentioned in your book. It comes from a book called The Autopsy of Atheism. And if you ever have a chance to read this book, I encourage you to do so. It's still published by J.C. Choate, publishers out of Mississippi. It's written by Brother Stanley Sayers. And he makes this statement. He says, one of the significant and obvious reasons the unbeliever remains an unbeliever is that he likes it that way. In fact, any evidence of any source or to any degree fails to move him from his position if his heart is strongly bent against evidence and toward unbelief. If you have a pen or a pencil, I want you to underline that statement right there. Against evidence and toward unbelief. That is a bias against God. They enjoy living a sinful life. They enjoy being worldly. They don't want to believe in God because they don't want to change their life. And if they place their faith in God, that would require them to make a change. And so they develop an attitude of indifference. You know, we have a bias against God because we really don't want to live a life according to the precepts of God. We'd rather live according to the world. Therefore, our bias would be against God. Basically, you can believe if you want to, but don't expect me to believe. That's their mentality. If you want to believe in God, go for it. But don't talk to me about it. I don't want to hear about it. I like my life just the way it is. They have a bias against God. But this is not a new problem. You have your Bible with you? Open to Romans chapter 1. If you don't have your Bible, I think all of this is in your book as well. Romans chapter 1, let's look at verses 21 and 28. Paul is talking about an issue that was taking place in the city of Rome. And it had to do with this concept of a bias toward the world and against God. He says, knowing God, glorified Him not as God, neither gave thanks, but became vain in their reasonings, and their senseless heart was darkened. And even as they refused to have God in their knowledge, God gave them up unto a reprobate mind. So notice what Paul is saying in this statement. He says they don't want to think about God. They don't want to consider His ways. They don't want to consider whether He's right or wrong. They don't want to even think about it. And he uses this term, their senseless heart. Literally what that means is that the reasoning that they have in their heart does not make sense. You ever known anybody that when you talk to them, they just don't make any sense? There may be some of you thinking, well, Josh, there's a lot of times you don't make any sense. But have you ever known anybody that when you talk to them, they may try to defend their view and you just kind of scratch your head, they don't make any sense. Well, that's what Paul was saying about the Romans. He said their hearts, what was coming forth, it was senseless. It didn't make any sense. It wasn't logical. Their hearts had been darkened to the ways of God. They had a bias against God. And so what was God going to do? He said He was going to give them up to a reprobate mind. If that's how they wanted to live their life, so be it. They had the right to do that. Well, then we have a second reason for unbelief. And anyone that has young children, we need to pay very close attention to this section. There are so many people in the world around us today who do not believe in God because their parents did not believe in God or did not encourage them to believe in God. Folks, we hear a lot about parents encouraging faith in their children. We hear a lot about people saying, well, I was raised in a Christian home. My parents taught me the Scriptures and we studied the Bible together and we went to church and we developed this appreciation for God and for His Word from a very young age. But then take a step back. What if you didn't have that upbringing? What if you grew up knowing nothing about God? I've shared with you before about the young girl at Newton Street in Paragould that after a couple weeks she stopped me and she said, "Who's Jesus? I've never heard of Him before." So many times we take for granted that people don't have the same upbringing. I'm thankful to God I was raised in a Christian home. And all of us here that were raised in a Christian home, I'm sure you would agree. But we have to understand that those who were not raised in that type of setting, with that type of upbringing, where was their influence coming from? It's coming from the world. From the world. And the world that we live in does not point people to Christ. Parents can either influence faith or they can kill faith. They can produce faith, or they can bring about a lack thereof. A statement that's found in the book here, and I like this statement, is that a child's mind is like Jell-O. And that's the parent's task to put in all the good stuff before it sets up. I like that. What that's saying is you better start at a young age. Just as we see in the example of Timothy, who began from a young age to be trained in the Scriptures by his mother and his grandmother. But to use a modern term, if we wait till we're old and we're set in our ways, the chances of getting through to a person like that with the truth is very hard. Once we have established a belief system, very hard to change that. Even if, like we talked about with some of these examples of unbelievers, even if we are presented with evidence, well, that's not what I was taught. That's not what Mom and Dad said. That's not what my friends believe. These things get ingrained within our minds. And that starts with our parents. Our parents are the first teachers that we have. They influence us greatly. I've always loved this passage from Deuteronomy chapter 6, and I think this is included in the book also. Yes, it is. Deuteronomy 6, verses 6 and 7, and I think it paints such a beautiful picture of a Christian home and the way that parents are to influence their children. It says, "And these words which I command thee this day shall be in thine heart, and thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children, and shalt talk of them when thou sittest in thine house, and when thou walkest by the way, and when thou liest down, and when thou risest up." Simply put, your faith should permeate every aspect of your life. It shouldn't be something that you discuss only on Sundays and Wednesdays. It should be something that you talk about frequently. Notice it gives the examples there. It says you teach these things to your children. You talk about them when you're at home, when you're just sitting around conversing with each other, when you're walking together, when you're spending time together. You talk about these things. When you rise up, when you lay down, from the time you wake up till the time you go to bed. There's never a bad time to talk about God and about His will. And as parents, and I'm speaking to myself just as much as anybody else, as parents, this is something that we all need to focus upon. This is something that we all need to recognize the importance of. Because generally speaking, if parents engage in sin, children are going to engage in sin. If parents go to church, their children, generally speaking, will grow up to develop faith and be Christian people. But if parents do not believe in God, more often than not, their children will grow up to be opposed to God. And ultimately what it comes down to is this: our children are watching us. They're soaking up everything that they see, everything that they hear from us. You know, it's like the country song that came out several years ago where it talks about the little boy heard his dad say a cuss word, and before you knew it, the little boy was saying that word. And it goes on a little bit further, and it talks about the dad walked in and saw the little boy on his knees praying, and he asked the boy where he learned that, and he said he saw it from him. And you know, there's these different examples that it goes through, and the whole premise of the song is, "I've been watching you, Dad." Well, there's a truth to that. Our children watch us. They learn from us. And it's amazing as we watch our children and we hear the things that they say, and you think, where did they learn that? And then before you know it, you've said the same thing and you pick up on it. They're learning from us. They're soaking that up. What are we instilling in them? Is it faith or is it disbelief? I want to leave you tonight with this statement. And this is one that is not in your book, but I think it's a good one for us to keep in mind. From 1 Timothy 4 and verse 12. Paul tells this young man, he says, "But be thou an example of the believers in word, in conversation, in charity, in spirit, in faith, and in purity." Live a Christian life. Be an example. In this context, be an example to your children, to your grandchildren, to all of those that you have the ability to have an influence over. Be an example of a Christian. All right, we're going to stop there for tonight. Lord willing, next Wednesday night, and we're probably going to spend most of the class time next Wednesday night on this one point because it is so important in our day and time, and that is improper education. So if you would, be sure and read over this next section. Hopefully we'll have the projector working next week, and we'll be able to all enjoy the slides that only I've been able to see tonight.